Welcome, everybody. We are going to get started here in just one moment. Okay, welcome. I am Jess Delfiaco. I'm the Communications Manager for the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And we are so happy to have you all joining us for our very first Innovation and Adaptation speaker event. I've got a couple housekeeping notes before we get started. First of all, that we are recording this webinar. It'll be published on our website and our YouTube channel. Secondly, if you have questions for Emily or Jessica, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A function at any point over the next hour. We will have some reserved time for Q&A at the very end. The majority of our time is going to feature Jessica and Emily in conversation with each other, but I want to spend just a couple minutes before we get started introducing you to what the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center is, what we do, and why we're launching this particular speaker series. The Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or the Midwest CASC as we call it, is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a consortium of 9 institutions in the Midwest, hosted by the University of Minnesota. You'll see a map of our region on the next slide. We bring together scientists and natural and cultural resource managers to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people in the Midwest adapt to a changing climate. And we are actually part of a national network of 9 climate adaptation science centers across the country. Next slide here. So we accomplish this mission in several different ways, including conducting synthesis research on topics relevant to regional priorities, hosting capacity building workshops and different events for our community. We support the next generation of climate scientists through programming and training for graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. And of course, we fund climate adaptation research projects and partnerships with the USGS. So you've heard me describe quite a few different things that the Midwest CASC is already doing, and you might be wondering why are we starting this new series devoted to innovation and adaptation? So to explain, first I wanted to share this quote from a recent report that came out on innovation in climate adaptation, which was published by the National Wildlife Federation. It was featured authorship from several different CASCs, including Jessica Hellmann. And it says, innovation depends on creativity, insight, and inspiration, as well as a willingness to experiment, test assumptions, and learn from failure. Just as climate adaptation can be thought of as a
process and not an endpoint, successful innovation typically results from an intentional and iterative process. So we believe that innovation is important to the evolution and the applicability of the climate adaptation field. I'm going to hand things over to one of today's speakers, Jessica Hellmann. But first, a couple words about who she is. Jessica Hellmann is the Consortium Director of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. She is also the Executive Director and Ecolab Chair in Environmental Leadership at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. And she's a distinguished McKnight University professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Good.
Here's you.
Okay, terrific. Well, hello, everyone. As Jess Delfiaco just introduced, I'm Jessica Hellmann. I have the great privilege, in addition to serving as an executive director for the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, I lead the consortium of 8 institutional partners who are part of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, along with the U.S. Geological Survey. And we are really excited to bring this new seminar series to you, and grateful for Emily Wasley of being our first featured presenter or in conversation with me. I'm going to take a moment to introduce you, Emily, and then we're going to have a dialogue. I have some questions. We're going to discuss, Emily and myself, for maybe half an hour, and then we'll also be taking questions from the audience in the Q&A function. So Emily Wasley is a highly accomplished climate change risk adaptation and resilience leader with almost 20 years of experience, which is precisely why we have her with us today. She was lead author for the Adaptation and Resilience chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment, which was released just this past fall. She's also a board member of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and she's a member of Women in Climate Tech. Currently, she serves as the head of climate resilience and biodiversity for Meta company-wide. Before her role at Meta, Emily held leadership roles at a number of leading consulting firms, including WSP, the Cadmus Group, and Booz Allen Hamilton. And also in her background and resume is a period of time where she served as a program manager, and I love this title, for informing decisions and adaptation science at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. So she has seen many different aspects in the private sector and in the public sector of what it means to adapt, and most recently shared her knowledge through the National Climate Assessment. So we are so happy, Emily, to have you with us here today. I know you also know a little bit about the Climate Adaptation Science Centers and what we seek to do for the federal government within the Department of Interior, and we're thrilled to have you at least virtually here with us in the Midwest. And I know that our listeners, our attendees, would like to hear about sort of who you are and maybe an overview of your past work and the work that you're doing now. But when you do that, I really always like to ask, what are you sort of striving toward? Like, what are you working to achieve through your professional contributions? And maybe also a little bit why you think that's important. So tell us about your work, what you're striving toward, and why that's such an important thing to be working on, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for having me today. I'm a big fan and worked very closely with Melissa Kenny for several years at USGCRP, as well as on our National Climate Assessment Adaptation Chapter. So really appreciate her support, and you have a great team. So
We're
a little
big
bit
fans of Melissa Kenny too.
Isn't everyone?
Yes.
So what, okay, a little bit about me. So I was born and raised in London, England, moved to the United States for college, undergrad, and really started my career in the climate adaptation space when I was at Booz Allen, because for those of you not familiar with Booz Allen, it's a large consultancy that works with the intel community, military, and defense. So given that, we had a lot of folks that were doing a lot of future scenario planning, tabletop exercises, and with my climate environmental background, I started to work with them on how to actually design future scenarios globally so that our clients would be able to prepare for and respond to any sort of potential physical risks related to climate change that would exacerbate other existing stressors in those regions. So got into that there, and then was recruited to be the Adaptation Science and Informing Decisions lead at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which I was able to work within the Obama administration on some really cool projects. We worked with a variety of different cities across the U.S. To host tabletop exercises and basically workshops where we brought multi-stakeholders together from the private sector, from the public sector, from academia, from faith-based communities, NGOs, to really kind of brainstorm what a future scenario in 2040 would do for that community and how we can prepare collectively for those impacts. And so loved that work, and then was recruited by a consultancy to lead up an adaptation team within the Cadmus group. And that's where things shifted a little bit, where I was during the election and the election results, I was made to think about not just the federal work, but also corporate side. So that's when I got into corporate resilience. So since then, I'm now at Meta. I was asked to join Meta and lead all of our climate resilience and biodiversity work, where I work across our data centers, our offices, our supply chain, and products and services. And I can get into some of the projects that I work on, but a lot of what's driving my current role is we need to be able to manage and understand what physical impacts Meta will face and how we can help support the critical infrastructure that we depend on, like power utilities and water utilities and the land and the communities that support us. But there are also a slew of new regulatory requirements around the world that's driving us to better and more transparently disclose what risks we face. So the reason why I got into this work and the drivers for what I do is to really help people and help nature and help communities prepare for and enhance their resilience to climate change. I see a lot of value in strength and resilience, and there are communities that have been forced to be resilient and others that have yet to flex that muscle. And so that's why I do what I do, and I love what I do.
I know that many of us, a lot of people on this webinar come from the natural resource space. At least the climate adaptation science centers are principally focused on natural and cultural resources. And so sometimes we're thinking about these things from a government or a public entity point of view, whether that be municipal government, tribal government, state or national government. And so one of the things I'm really hoping, as you describe that arc of your career, that we could talk about like the different value propositions or different contributions of sectors and thinking about what resiliency is and how we mitigate those climate risks. So listening to you talk about the arc of your career, starting at Booz Allen and then coming into the Obama administration, and even the words you use, resilience, adaptation, risk, understanding the risks that we face under climate change, there's been a lot of evolution in this, what we might call adaptation field or discipline, or just even the creation of it. I'm wondering what is your understanding of adaptation as a discipline right now? Sort of its strengths or its weaknesses. You mentioned, for example, some communities doing great, other communities maybe not ready to face the future in front of them. So can you talk about the sort of arc of what we call adaptation science or resiliency, what you've noticed about it and what you think of it now?
Sure. So, I mean, the concept and the theory and the practice of adaptation has been long in place in the ecosystem world, right? The natural systems world. And through various different political changes and whatnot, there are new terms that have been coming up, like resilience, that mean so many different things to different people and mean nothing to a lot of people, right? So the challenge has been, how are we defining adaptation? To whom, to what, with whom, for whom, right? So I see adaptation as very local. It has to take place with the communities and with the organizations that provide a voice for the ecosystems that we depend on, that really needs to evolve over time in terms of how we're thinking about our natural resources, how we're protecting those natural resources, how we can leverage lessons learned from biomimicry or whatnot to apply to different solutions. And so I feel as though in terms of the adaptation field right now, there's so many new opportunities out there for investments, for funding, but the challenges, and we mentioned this in our report, the adaptation chapter, is that there's differential access to funding and investments. And so some communities may not have the capacity to write a grant to get funding for an adaptation plan or for a solution that they want to put into place before an event happens. Others may have a lot of consultants that work for them in our big cities and have a lot of resources that they can access. And so there's the differential access challenge. There's also the challenge of, and we'll get into this further, I think, in our conversation, of different communities taking incremental actions because that's maybe what they can afford, or maybe that's what they understand. And incremental is meaning, short-term kind of quick fixes that will address maybe one hazard, like extreme heat. So, for example, okay, let's make sure that our communities have access to air conditioning, versus transformational changes, which are more related to how we're designing buildings and how we're retrofitting buildings to be able to withstand these climate hazards for the long term, and not just putting the Band-Aid on it through incremental changes. So there are a variety of different kind of aspects of the field right now. I think the exciting part is that there are so many new opportunities that students or recent graduates can really jump into based on their knowledge and based on their training, and their eagerness to get into the space, that I think, it's an opportunity right now. And I'm, as you mentioned, I'm on the board of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. It's a great network. If those of you who haven't joined it already, check it out. It's a space where you can feel safe and feel like family and connect and collaborate as you want on adaptation.
And it's a professional society that a place actually to craft what are the professional norms and even some of the objectives of what adaptation professionals are doing. I think it's interesting when you look at that organization too, you see adaptation emerging in places that it hadn't even been thought of a few years before, sort of growing the reach of who needs to be thinking about adaptation. I was part of a working group recently that generated a report on innovation in adaptation, was funded by the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, was pursued in partnership with the National Wildlife Federation. And we also talk a lot about that incremental change and how we need to infuse the discipline of adaptation with a new degree of sort of risk-taking in a suite of new tools that are perhaps not something that we would have pursued before we were confronted with climate change. And I know that's something that you talked about in your in the National Climate Assessment. I have actually a specific question about the National Assessment. In referencing something you said that adaptation is fundamentally a local phenomena that's done with communities and local voices for ecosystems. And yet we write a national assessment. And we're also talking about adaptation targets like through the UN Conference of the Parties. How do you rectify that? Think about something globally and nationally, or say across an entire company like Meta, with a process that's fundamentally local. And maybe you could also tell us some of the other conclusions from the assessment report.
Sure. So it is a massive challenge. I'll just say that, that I don't think anyone has quite figured out yet. But I do know that, yeah, so having a national assessment basically synthesize data and information at a national level is challenging when it comes to adaptation. But what we tried to do was to weave throughout the National Climate Assessment very sectoral-based solutions related to adaptation, as well as regional solutions, so that we highlighted the actions that are taking on the ground, and wove that into our key message one, which is that adaptation is occurring, but it's insufficient, right? And so we have this map that illustrates across the US where there are states that have climate adaptation plans. That's one indicator that we could measure, that something's happening. But the challenge is that we don't have a systematic way to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of adaptation actions, the sufficiency of those actions, and whether they're leading to maladaptation or are they leading to success, and what does success look like? So that was, one of our key findings, is that more monitoring and evaluation needs to happen at the local level to really understand, okay, what solutions are working and why, and how can we share those solutions across the board so that other communities can understand what works and what doesn't, so that they're not wasting resources on solutions that may not be effective in the long term.
I'm really enamored with this idea. I mean, of course, maladaptation, how do we know it? So I think sometimes people think, well, we'll recognize maladaptation when we see it, but we need to actually be able to proactively avoid it. But I'm really enamored with this idea of sufficiency, because if you look at the nature of the conversation around mitigation, we talk about, right, we have goals and we say we have emissions targets and we can calculate, we need this much solar and this much wind, and we can answer this question of sufficiency. I think what do you think about that? What is sufficiency? And what are some of the data around monitoring that would allow us to ask if we're doing enough or doing a good enough job?
That is a great question. And I'm not an expert in kind of indicators or monitoring and evaluation of effectiveness or sufficiency for adaptation, but I do know that we have to start somewhere. And I think what could be helpful is before and after incidents related to extreme weather events, we measure, okay, what actions were taken, what investments were made, what perhaps social cohesion activities were taken, what governance structures are in place before the event, and then we measure kind of what was the aftermath and what were the repercussions. So, for example, if a community decides to build a seawall and there's a hurricane and it floods the inside of that community, was that seawall effective, right?
No,
Or
it was not sufficient. Yeah.
right, exactly. And could we create more of a natural berm or like protect wetlands that are, slowing down that hurricane force? And so I think that is a way that we could really start to think about, because there are actions that we're taking now that, and I don't know if we'll get into this, but the Stafford Act, FEMA has been trying to update it, but I think it still requires that if you want state funding or federal funding, you have to build back to what was and not what will be. And so that's a huge barrier for adaptation, transformational adaptation, because if we're building back in areas that are vulnerable to climate change, like a wetland or a floodplain, that's not going to do us any favors. It's not going to be sufficient.
Right. We'll just be battling. Yeah. So let's talk about some more of those barriers. So one barrier to transformational adaptation is this return to baseline expectation that we'll build back what was rather than what could be. What are some other barriers that you see to the notion of transformational adaptation as you define it?
I think just inherently humans are not comfortable with change, and transformational adaptation takes change. It takes change management, it takes organizational change management. And so humans have the inclination to preserve the current state, even if changes bring greater benefits. And so, and also like preserving the status quo, we found can actually perpetuate existing systems of inequality. So the discomfort that we need to face and experience, which actually COVID taught us a lot of we were forced to adapt. We have to understand as a human species that nature will survive without us. But if we want to survive and if we want to, adapt and thrive in a changing climate, we need to understand that transformational change is required. So I think that's one barrier, is just like getting past the fact that change is going to be hard. We need it through our governance structures. We need it through our institutional changes. We need laws to change, design standards to be updated. So that's one area. I also think truly having an understanding of what adaptation is and what it's not. And a lot of people confuse adaptation with disaster response and recovery. And that's a pretty dangerous spot to be in, because adaptation is really thinking about proactive, long-term systemic changes, whereas emergency response and disaster recovery is kind of the waiting until an event happens and then, trying to put sandbags in as the floodwaters come, versus like not building in a floodplain. And if you do get flooded out, planning to work with a community to have community-led migration so that it's driven by the community. The community gets to decide how they want to migrate, and it's not continually putting them at risk. So yeah, truly understanding kind of what adaptation is and is not is important. I think also just a shared understanding that just because we need to invest in adaptation doesn't mean we're taking money away from mitigation.
No.
And that for a long time has been
Yeah.
a very, um, tense debate.
Hmm.
And so understanding that not only do we need to invest in adaptation, but the fact that our aging infrastructure is not resilient. Populations are migrating from vulnerable places to areas that may not have the capacity to be able to provide services to these new people that are coming into their jurisdictions. There's also an increasing demand for our very limited natural resources. So I think a common understanding that the situation we're in right now is not great, and adaptation and investing in climate resilience will help us in the long run. It will be expensive, but it's totally worth it, and it's found to be, I think, 5-to-1 cost benefit ratio, or 1-to-15. Yeah. So if you invest $1, you get $15 back in return. And it's been an area that's been really slow to get that investment that's needed.
We talk a little bit about, you said, like communities' ability to express their own needs, or for example, if you need a transformation, like moving to new areas or doing practices differently. And you also made a comment about the opportunity to address some systemic injustices. What do you see the relationship between climate justice, say broadly defined, or the opportunity for adaptation to directly address systemic inequalities? What's the relationship between notions of justice as related to climate and notions of adaptation?
Yeah, so that's an area that we really dove into throughout our chapter, but also throughout the entire National Climate Assessment. So you'll notice that there's equity and justice woven throughout because it's so interconnected. And if you're intentional about adaptation and the way that you're planning, and you plan inclusively with communities that are either going to be impacted or need to have a say in what happens to their community, then hopefully it will be successful. But a lot of times those decisions are being made without the community voices that will be impacted the most. And so you get these actions or these solutions that are not equitable. They may exacerbate injustices and really harm the communities that you know, trying to help. And adaptation practitioners have the best of intentions, right? We really try to think about equity at its center. We understand the difficulties and the challenges that climate change has on communities that have faced injustices forever. And so the last thing we want to do is to worsen those injustices. But in order to make sure that we are transparent and collaborative, we have to include those voices from the start and throughout. So we can't just, come up with a plan and then ask them to review it. That's not going to work.
Great. Let's turn, if you will, to you work in the private sector. And when you were describing your career arc, you talked about both being in public service, federal government, and now also in the private sector. Can you tell us a little bit, do you see the specific role or responsibility or opportunity for the private sector to be advancing adaptation? And I suppose you could further elaborate, but if those of us are coming from a natural resource sector, is there a specific way in which natural resource adaptation and how the private sector is approaching adaptation? Is there an overlap there, or how could we work together?
Sure. I think there are a lot of different opportunities. Some that we're engaging with are in relation to just some different innovations, different solutions that we might be investing in to scale up, because the private sector does have a lot of resources and a lot of funding, and we can pilot different solutions at our locations and with the surrounding communities to see if things are, does this work? Would it be a long-term solution? And one of the actions that we're trying to take now is to, in alignment with our net zero goal, is to reduce our diesel generators, which provide backup power for our data centers. And so there's a trade-off between doing that and also making sure that our data centers are protected and resilient in the face of extreme weather events. And so we're looking at different alternative energy sources to power those backup generators. Again, that's kind of an incremental shift, an incremental change. But there are different, solutions that exist out there. Also, the different cement that we're using, can it sequester carbon? Can it make sure that it's not providing to the urban heat island effect? And so there are different solutions that we can try to test at our facilities, but also in terms of engaging with communities, I think there's a lot that we can do related to sharing information and sharing results from different risk assessments that we've done. And I just completed a very in-depth engineering study across all of our different data centers at the building level. And we looked at not just the downtime potential for our data centers, but also the impacts to the power grid, to the water utilities, to the fiber network, so that we understood kind of what those vulnerabilities might be. And so can we share that with the different communities that also may not have resources to do this type of analysis? I think that's a huge opportunity for us to be a good steward in the communities. And there are just different ways that we can partner, perhaps with the power and the energy grid industry to help enhance their resilience as a, not just as Meta, but as a sector, or as, the broad private sector who depends on, excuse me, the power grid for operations. And so how can we come together as a consortium and really support that? On the natural resources side, I manage also the biodiversity program. So I incorporate biodiversity into climate resilience because it's a risk management measure. It's an enhancing resilience measure. And so we actually are protecting more land than we develop on. And so there are different ways that we work with NGOs, different ways that we work with academia to understand how we're measuring biodiversity, how we can enhance our biodiversity efforts, and really build that into thinking about how climate change will impact natural resources over time.
I just would like to reiterate or reflect back on you a couple of key things that I just heard you say that I'd like to make sure everyone in our audience hears. So at least through the CASCs, we are charged with pursuing adaptation science. And you're suggesting that the private sector is a piloting or testing of some of that innovation that might come from the scientific or from the research enterprise. I think that's really interesting. And then when you are doing analyses, you talk about sharing those results with other communities or organizations that might not have the scope or the reach that like a Meta might have when it's doing those analyses. And those are two really fascinating examples. Okay, I think we're going to move on to some questions from the audience. But before we do that, actually, I have one more question that I know people want to hear. And I wonder, Emily, if you might take just a moment and speak to some of our earlier career members. We did this already where you talked about joining the Adaptation Professional Society. But is there any other piece of advice or thought you might share with, say, graduate students or postdocs or early career folks who are making their way in the adaptation sector?
Absolutely. So one of them is to get out and vote. That's the first thing. The other thing is when I was early on in my career, I did a bunch of different informational interviews with people that had cool jobs that I may want to get into. And so I use LinkedIn a lot, and that's a great resource to kind of just search for people who have titles or backgrounds that you're interested in getting into, and just, ask them for a 30-minute call. People are always willing to talk about what they do, especially if they love it, and a lot of adaptation practitioners love what they do. So that's a good way for folks to kind of get connected. Um, Also, just get a better understanding of the different regulations that are coming out. So you mentioned, Jessica, about different companies needing to set climate adaptation targets. We're in the process of doing that, and it's a challenge. And how do we measure that across Meta is something that we're exploring. And so these regulations are really driving a lot of action in the corporate sector. And so getting a better understanding of what is in those regulations, what's required, what's not. There's still, pending guidance coming out across the world on what specific things in terms of like what does an adaptation target look like, or how would you measure it? And it's very different than a net zero target, right? Because as you mentioned, you're counting carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. Hard to count adaptation. But there are different ways that we're exploring to do that. So yeah, and then also where you're investing your time and money, and are you investing in companies that are not forward thinking in terms of climate action? Are you thinking about your 401k when you get a job? Like, can you diversify your portfolio to invest in companies that are taking action and are being transparent about the action that they're taking? So those are just a couple of ways that I would suggest they can engage.
So a clarifying question, when you're saying well, first of all, you're saying be engaged in the political process, but also when you say look at policies and regulation and expectations and standards that are coming down, because those are professional opportunities, like how we're going to monitor and how the private sector and other entities will have to respond. Those are places where there will be like books of business that need to be filled. Is that what you're saying?
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. I mean, there's a huge need for people who understand the regulations, who can run scenario analysis or interpret scenario analysis done, who can think creatively about, okay, what does adaptation mean for a corporation that has an extensive supply chain, or different customers that are across different sectors. And so the regulations are really driving the need for more practitioners in this space who not only understand the regulations, but understand how to implement the actions needed to comply with the regulations.
Mm-hmm. Including maybe even some methods that we don't have yet that we're going to have to make up.
Exactly.
Okay, so in my Q&A, and folks online, please keep it coming. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, please drop them in our Q&A window. I'm going to combine a couple of here because I've got a few people who are asking about monitoring and evaluation. There's a question, for example, about the need to monitor so that you can update adaptation actions. And then also there's a question about monitoring and evaluation to look at effectiveness and to communicate how successful you are. So what are you thinking, either specific to the work that you're doing at Meta or other similar types of entities that you might be familiar with on this sort of monitoring, evaluation, and updating and study improvements?
Sure. So, in general, I think the private sector can certainly be measuring and monitoring impacts from natural and climate related hazards. That's kind of one of the easy low-hanging fruit areas. So if there was any downtime, if there was a financial loss, if there was, a interruption to their supply chain, understanding how that affected their business, and making sure that the lessons learned are captured and that measures are taken to kind of manage that in the future. As it relates to adaptation, again, in the private sector, it's still a new area for a lot of different companies. And so they're still trying to figure it out. And I think a lot of the companies that may be ahead in this space are in sectors that have been impacted by climate change events, or have, developed in manufacturing locations in areas that are prone to flooding or prone to hurricanes. And so I think they're learning very quickly to take measures and to monitor kind of what is happening in the climate, also conduct scenario analysis so that they can plan ahead and prepare for what's coming. And one concern that I do have is when it comes to actions that private sector can take is not thinking about equity. And so there was an incident after Harvey that one company who had a manufacturing location in the Texas region decided to take their manufacturing plant and relocate it to Arkansas. And so they had to, either pay their folks to relocate. So that's displacing people from their homes, from their culture, from their historic heritage. And did they take that into consideration when they were making that decision? So there are different ways that I think the public sector or the private sector can monitor and evaluate actions that they're taking, but also the actions that lead to unintended consequences.
Right. And the rest of us, sort of society at large, watching and having expectations for our private sector, for the private sector about doing that in a way that is equitable and socially just.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question here that I'm going to try to answer. And then I have another two that I'm going to group together. A question is, you talked about how disaster planning is not adaptation. And there's a question here about clarification, saying a little bit more about that. I'm going to try. You tell me if you think this is right. So I think when we think about disaster planning, and what you were suggesting is we have a disaster and then we need to recover from it, right? So something bad happens, we need to meet people's needs and steer them through the disaster, but maybe get us back to where we were before. That's disaster management, and trying to minimize the impacts of that particular disaster. Versus adaptation would be steering us to a new set of future configurations of maybe the way we manage an ecosystem, or where physical infrastructure is located, or how the infrastructure is built, that will change the nature of how the next disaster is experienced, or to reduce its effects altogether. So disaster planning or emergency response being about minimization of impact, and adaptation being about system management to make us more resilient in the face of climate change. You think that's fair?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the only thing I would add is that the disaster recovery space is really get people back into their homes, get them, back to normal living. And if a community has a climate adaptation plan in place with some options of how to get people back into their homes in a more safe and adaptive manner,
I do
then
it differently.
that is how disaster response and recovery and adaptation can work very nicely together. But if there is no climate adaptation plan and it's just, okay, let's get people back to where they were, it could happen again. It could happen even worse in the future. And so that's kind of the difference between how disaster recovery and response can work together with adaptation, and how I loved your explanation of how it's different.
That's great. Okay, so I have a couple questions here asking specifically about the private sector, mostly that the private sector is private. So does that limit your ability to, say, share information, and when you're doing innovation, to export it to other people? That's sort of part one. And then relatedly, because you're private and you of course have social responsibilities, you have to follow the law, and the law is changing and evolving, but you also have duty to shareholders and to return on investment. And how does that affect your how aggressive you are on adaptation, or maybe even get pushback on investing too much? So let's talk about sort of intellectual property, private sector, not share or not share, and scrutiny, if you will, about whether or not these, say, investments in adaptation are justified from a profit point of view.
Yeah. So the share and not share is a great point, because yes, there are IP issues, there are privacy issues, but a way for different companies to perhaps be effective stewards in communities could be to host workshops or host roundtables or host tabletop exercises like I did within my position at U.S. Global Change Research Program, is bring folks together who are in those communities that have different roles, have different voices, and play out scenario narratives and use the data that not only we have collected, but also what other organizations have collected, and see, okay, how is it similar? How is it different? How can we, are we planning for the same future? Do we have different visions for what a resilient community looks like? And just having those discussions collaboratively, I think, is a really good way to share that information, be transparent, talk about what actions we can take, talk about what actions the community members are taking, or the different organizations or businesses in that community are taking, and like what more is needed to achieve a more resilient future for that community. So I think that's one way, instead of just like, saying, here's our data dump and expecting them to understand what that all means, but actually use it to inform a decision and inform a collaborative plan that can help the community overall. Your question about, can you repeat your question on?
Like you do pushback or return on investment expectations. Do you ever have folks say, we shouldn't be doing so much on this adaptation, we don't need to, or you haven't made a business case for it sufficiently? No?
I haven't heard any of that, especially because now it's required by regulatory entities. Not only, so the European Union has a corporate sustainability reporting directive, so CSRD, that's driving a lot of the actions that are being taken across different private sector entities to comply with those regulations. You have to do a lot of work now on climate mitigation and adaptation. And so that's driving a lot of why we're doing this, apart from the fact that we know that it's the right thing to do. Now we can say, well, it's required. And so,
Have to.
yeah, so there's very little pushback, especially, I mean, there's some pushback in the way that there are no current frameworks for corporate climate adaptation planning. There are no standards, no guidance. So we're kind of developing this as we go. And actually, we have a partnership with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES, who's coming out with a position paper very shortly on different corporate principles for climate resilience, as well as a longer term initiative that they're launching to develop some sort of framework and guidance for corporations on how to enhance their climate resilience. And the principles that we used, a lot of them were built from the American Society of Adaptation Professionals living guide for how to be an adaptation professional and practitioner. So we leveraged a lot of different existing resources to come up with those core principles.
So I've got a couple of people following up on this, Emily, who are asking, they're hearing you say regulation and compliance a fair amount. And then you talked about exposure to risk and risk mitigation from sort of an operations point of view. I've got a couple of folks saying, is there anything else? Use social responsibility perhaps as related to, I don't know, employee engagement or employee, what are there some other angles to, in addition to compliance and risk, business
Absolutely.
operational avoidance?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main reasons why I joined Meta was because we want, like, the employees that work at Meta want to make a positive impact on the world. And so although there might be some pushback on Meta as a company and kind of social media in general, our intention is to be extremely supportive and to bring communities together, to bring them stronger relationships and whatnot. So what folks do with that is kind of outside of our control somewhat, but I do think that I mean, everyone that I've met within Meta has so much drive to take on climate action, to invest in biodiversity, to volunteer for different actions, different initiatives. And so there's a lot of employee engagement in this topic. And there's also, yeah, the reputational aspect of it, and being a good steward and providing services that are continuous and that are also, you know, leveraging ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to protect different communities and resources from climate hazards.
So let's talk about, I have a couple of questions actually about, we could take the employee angle here. I love it that you mentioned there, maybe some people have some thoughts about social media and what it's accomplishing. That may be true. But let's talk about what the folks are asking about professional opportunities specifically as related to adaptation in the private sector. I have a question asking what kinds of capabilities and professional skills are appropriate for engaging in adaptation work, maybe like to be the you of other companies and settings is one. And then I have a comment saying, despite the rhetoric that there are a lot of sustainability roles out there, it still seems quite competitive. So maybe what do you see about the trajectory of opportunities, maybe specific to adaptation or sustainability generally? So what do people need to be able to do? What are the roles and capacities that they have? And then do you really see growth in this adaptation sector within employment in the private sector? Let's keep it specific to the private sector.
Sure. So yes, the sustainability space and like as it relates to kind of climate mitigation, the greenhouse gas accounting, that space is super crowded because there are a lot of folks that have been doing this for a long time. They're trained in it in grad school. Whereas on the climate adaptation side, there aren't as many schools that are investing curriculum in climate adaptation or climate risk assessments on evaluating exposure and vulnerability and what to do about those vulnerabilities. And so that the space coming out of grad school or college, undergrad, there is a group kind of an understanding that having some experience in that space for adaptation is helpful because you might learn some theories or concepts about adaptation, but having that practice and that practical experience is really, really helpful. And so even if it's just at the ground level, you intern for an organization during the summertime, make sure you get paid because, it's the adaptation space is very undervalued in terms of like pay. And so make sure that you do get a job that can pay you what you're worth. But also given the fact that this is such a growing area, because we're seeing more extreme weather events happening, we're seeing companies more engaged in this topic. There will be, I see in the future, many more open positions for teams to grow in this space. As it stands right now within Meta, I'm on the net zero team and I'm one person that manages climate resilience and biodiversity across the company. So there's still like a lack of capacity within companies, but I see that growing just like it did in the sustainability space. It's just being patient and really digging into what brings you joy and start there.
And what about skill sets for that kind of thing? Climate,
Sure.
you need to understand climate risk and
Mhm.
exposure.
Yeah.
You've talked about scenario analysis. What are some other skill sets?
Yeah, understanding scenario analysis, how to conduct a climate risk assessment, how to understand the difference between inherent risk and residual risk. If you have an engineering degree, perhaps like what different engineering and mechanical systems can help to help us adapt in different buildings. But there's a lot of relationship building and a lot of like connecting internally
Yeah.
that is so important. And like building relationships, building strong, trusted relationships is probably the number one
Yeah.
capability I would suggest. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a terrific insight. Those skills about bringing different capacities within a company together to collaborate in new and creative ways, to be able to bring analytical skills, but also lots and lots of relational and creative thinking skills as well. So I know Jess wants 1 minute to wrap us up, but Emily, anything else you want to say? Something else on your mind that's not a question or in the few moments remaining?
Well, I think we sort of touched on this, but the topic of this is innovation. And I think there's so many opportunities in the adaptation space for new innovations, new piloting of solutions, whether it's, if in the efficiency space for energy and water efficiency or ecosystem restoration and making sure that we're protecting the reefs that we depend on for, survival basically in this world. How we're designing and creating new resilient buildings and materials and different community engagement education methods that we can use so that we have voices at the table when it may not be as possible in different ways. And I know AI has been a big topic recently, and how can we leverage AI to help monitor and track sufficiency or effectiveness or where actions are occurring. So I think there's so much opportunity for innovation in this space. And so I think just stay tuned and see what happens.
The beautiful final point. Thank you for bringing us back to innovation. And Jess, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, huge thank you to you, Jessica, to you, Emily, for joining us today. Thanks to everybody who took the time to hang out with us for a bit. We'd love if you stay in touch with the Midwest CASC. However, you would like to do that. We've got a monthly newsletter. We've got a website. We do kind of similar events like this every month that dig a little bit more deeply into our research and kind of region-specific topics. And as I said, this is an ongoing series, so we will have future innovation and adaptation opportunities for you to get involved. So with that, I'm going to let you all go back to your days. And thanks again for joining us.